Sorry for that interruption. Let me continue where I left off talking about John Locke. Uh, Transitioning over from John Locke, you had an individual named Pierre Bell. Pierre Bell was a Frenchman and a Huguenot who took refuge from the government from persecution of the Dutch Republic. Bell critically examined the religious beliefs and persecutions of the past in a book called A Historical and Critical Dictionary, stating that human beliefs had been extremely varied and often mistaken, concluding that nothing can ever be known beyond a doubt, which this view is known as skepticism. Okay, so Bell formulated a new ideology called skepticism. Okay, Pierre Bell, he was a Huguenot from the French upper class, and he wrote a book entitled The Historical and Critical Dictionary. This book was published in 1697. So you had, again, as we have looked at Europe's history and looked at the Dark Ages, things we've discussed through the course of the semester, we know that the Dark Ages is a period of stagnation, superstition, illiteracy, disease, poor climate, poor health. We are now seeing major transitions from the European with books that were coming out and this whole new concept of the Enlightenment. You have a Jewish philosopher. His name is Baruch Spinoza. He was a key figure as it relates to the scientific revolution and Enlightenment. His position was that the mind and the body are united in one substance, and God and nature were merely two names for the same thing. Spinoza asserted that God and nature are actually the same thing, just called by two different names, following somewhat of the natural order of things. I want you to get that about Spinoza. Now, and as I said, Spinoza was Jewish, a follower of the Torah, a believer in Judaism. But he believed that God and nature were two names for the same concept. Interesting, as you look through that, you can find more information as it relates to him. Going to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is another Frenchman, in the year 1770, Rousseau was passionately committed to the idea of individual freedom. Now, we haven't had individual freedom under absolutism. Why? Because with absolute power and the divine right of kings, the king owned everything. You were beholding to the king owned the land. You either had the nobility, the noble class, those who were warriors, knights and things of that nature, and the peasants, the common man, the worker. But Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his political contribution called The Social Contract. The social contract. What exactly is the social contract? Okay, let me give you an overview of what that is. The social contract is not literally something that's signed, but it is an agreement that the government will hold the best interests of the people in mind. Should be the role of government, to hold the best interests of the people in mind. In addition to that, Rousseau also coined the term general will. I want you to get this, guys. General will. General will states that it is sacred and absolute, that the common interests are the greater good of the people. This is kind of like the foundation of democracy. The will of the people. What do the people want collectively? Some states, like we have, legalized gambling in Louisiana. Some states have recreational marijuana. Some people may not, perhaps can't buy alcoholic beverages after a particular time. However, it is the general will. The interests are what the people want, in layman's terms. And that's Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And the social contract was written in 1762. So Spinoza was a Huguenot. Pierre Bell was a Huguenot. I'm sorry, I stand corrected. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote the social contract. Now, here's another individual that brought about from an economic standpoint, as we look at how things derive and what was the state of affairs concerning economics. We know what economics is, and in America, the economic system is capitalism. Okay? Capitalism. We know capitalism is predicated upon making a profit, is predicated upon supply and demand. Those things that you learned in high school, the fundamentals of free enterprise, the ability of a person to profit from their own ideas and be seeking to strive or make their aspirations and own self-interests. Adam Smith wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, which is a direct challenge to the mercantilist policies of Europe. We discussed mercantilism in the last chapter, so we know what that is. I won't go into that. But in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith said that, hey, man has the right to strive for his own self-interest, to have something of his own. Let me go back, because John Locke also said, and I mentioned, that people have the right to life, liberty, and the ownership of property. That was a big deal, guys, in Europe. That was a big deal to own property, because the king owned everything. You were no more than a laborer or a renter. Thus you have these terms, landlord, the owner, the lord of the land. Okay? I mentioned in the last class that when you come around and talk about the Magna Carta and not the founding fathers, that's a term that I don't use, but I will say framers of the Constitution. The framers of the Constitution came from this mindset. So they wanted to do something differently. They didn't want to be ruled by a monarch. They didn't believe in the divine right of kings anymore. That was played out. They didn't believe in absolutism, and they were moving toward new political aspirations. Okay, so they modeled the right to life, liberty, and the ownership of property, and what did they do? The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, tying together the pursuit of happiness with the ownership of property. the ability to own some land. That's important, guys. Let me move forward. Also, there is a term that came about from Adam Smith. Oh, well, let me go back. I'm sorry. He also wrote another book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And Smith argued that social interaction produced feelings of mutual sympathy that led people to behave in ethical ways despite inherent tendencies towards self-interest. That sometimes people can gravitate toward ethics if if it was not toward your personal interest. People would gravitate toward ethics. Now, what is ethics? If a person is ethical, if we were on teams, I would ask the question and say, what is ethics? What does being ethical mean? Being ethical means to have a sense of value about what is wrong or right. Being ethical, ethics, that's a layman's term for that. So we need to get that. The pursuit of individual self-interest in a competitive market would lead to an uprising of prosperity, what Adam Smith says. And Adam Smith coined the term. I know some of you have heard it. We're in Louisiana. We know about the French language, and Adam Smith said laissez-faire economics. What does laissez-faire mean? Laissez-faire means hands off. Hands off. And I mentioned this in the other class, that Smith said that business should be allowed to operate freely without government regulation, and that the invisible hand of the market will allow regulations or adjustments to the aforementioned market. But and when you listen to, again, Democrats and Republicans talking about, Republicans, government is too big. What does that mean? When Democrats say we want to provide more programs for the people, we need more oversight so people won't be taken advantage of. President feel that this is why the Great Depression arose under President Hoover. Herbert Hoover was the president when the Great Depression came after a period of great prosperity called the Roaring '20s. The United States fell into major decline and poverty. There was no government intervention. There was no government oversight. Now, government can be too big, but it is my contention, or my opinion, that there is a need for some government oversight. People will be exploited if the government does not intervene to some degree. Your position may be different, but this is what Adam Smith coined. And he coined the term also economic liberalism. I want you to be familiar with that verbiage. Economic liberalism. You have another gentleman, and I'm giving you a list of names. Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant was an Enlightenment philosopher. He spoke German, but he was a devout Christian. And Kant posed the question in a pamphlet entitled, "What is the Enlightenment?" Everybody was throwing this term around, but Kant said, what is the Enlightenment? And the answer is, one would dare to know. In other words, he continued, have the courage to use your own understanding is therefore the motto of the Enlightenment. So Immanuel Kant came about and said, the Enlightenment is about utilizing your own understanding of a thing. Does that necessarily make it right? That's up for debate. Does being told what to believe or this is an absolute truth? These are things that are open for debate. So Immanuel Kant said, what is the Enlightenment? He wrote a pamphlet. And he said, one must dare to know. To have the courage to use your own understanding about a thing. That is a profound comment in my book. Very, very profound. Very profound. Okay? Now, also in the Enlightenment era, there was really a major change as it relates to religion. And when you go through the chapter, you'll see issues about that, the development of the exchange of knowledge and information between Muslims and Christians. You had at this time period a strong Turkish presence and the Ottoman Empire, which is a conversation for another time period. Again, scientists also developed new taxonomies about race, the concept of race. And race is a man-made term because we know that the black man is the original man. Emphatically, that the out of Africa theory discusses the origin of the species in which we belong to, Homo sapiens, which migrated out of Africa 250 to 300,000 years ago. However, you had other human species, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, as well as Neanderthals, and there's about 15 other categorizations of anatomically upright humans, bipedal humans. But race classifications of races began to come in with Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who is considered to be the father of races. He was a German anthropologist. Now, in addition to him, you also had, again, Immanuel Kant and David Hume. You're going to have to know these names. Immanuel Kant, go and highlight it in your text. Immanuel Kant and David Hume popularized these ideas in text called Of Natural Characters in 1748, which Hume expressed his conviction that Negroes and in general all other species of men were naturally inferior to whites. That the black man is inferior to the white man, period. Genetically, in any other way, mentally, in any other fashion, that the black man and any other race is inferior. But we know, based on the works of Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, who deals with the conflict theory and talks about the genetic annihilation of those who categorize themselves as white, and being genetically recessive, homozygous recessive, the black man homozygous dominant, and the black man and woman has the independent ability to produce a white. But a white person cannot produce a black individual, so-called black. This is true. Genetics has supported this. Immanuel Kant wrote a book entitled The Different Races of Man. in 1775. Kant believed that there were 4 human races and each one derived from an original race. Then you get to Blumenbach, he had 5 racial categories. According to Kant, the closest descendant to the original race were the white inhabitants of Germany. Let me stop. Thus, you're looking at the idea of the Aryan, this white supremacist idea, Nordic, if you will, in that area around Germany, moving over toward, gravitating more toward the Caucasus Mountains and Georgia, where you get the verbiage Caucasian from these individuals that dwelled and lived in the Caucasus Mountains. This is where Blumenbach created his categories and said that the skulls, after measuring and testing these skulls, that these skulls were the most beautiful out of the skulls that he had experimented upon, and decided that these features were the best features of the phenotypical persuasion. So you got Immanuel Kant, David Hume, and Johann Blumenbach. Using the word race to designate biological distinct groups of humans was a new European thought. A European thought. Using the word race to designate phenotypical differences is a European concept. It is a European ideal. Keep that in mind. That's mandatory that you know that. Enlightened absolutism. Although absolutism began to play out, you had a series of kings and monarchs who still subscribed to absolutism but began to move into a different realm as it relates to absolutism. And they called it Enlightenmentism. One of the most noteworthy was Frederick the Great or Frederick II. Frederick II was called Frederick the Great. He promoted religious tolerance, free speech, and improved the educational system. Under his reign, precious laws were simplified. Torture of prisoners was abolished. Now, Prussia is Russia. Same place. But it was called Prussia then. We talked about in history how geography ties in to history, because the names of places haven't always been the same names. These are names that have changed over time due to invasions, wars, colonizations. These are names that have changed. But Frederick the Great is one of Russia's greatest leaders, in addition to St. Peter, Peter the Great, who St. Petersburg is named after. Also, you have Catherine the Great, who was also an enlightened monarch. You need to read through that and look at that as well. You had a movement among Jewish cultures called Haskalah. In the Jewish societies, you have Haskalah, which is the term that they used for the Enlightenment. I want you to be able to differentiate, class, the difference in the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Now, we know when we talked about the Aristotelian universe, the Copernican universe, how Europeans thought the earth was the center of the universe and that the earth was motionless. And then you came up with the Copernican theory that the earth was not motionless and that the earth rotated around the sun. In the Aristotelian theory, the sun moves around the earth, which we know that that's not true now. In addition to that, the earth has an orbit. We talked about that early on, so you are familiar with that. I wish I had time to go more into the concept of race, which is very important, and we will talk more about that when we deal with the concept of Africa. But let me give you this, and I mentioned it in the other chapter, so I feel inclined to kind of touch it since it's here in the textbook. As contracts among Atlantic coasts of the America, Africa, and Europe became more frequent, European settlers grew into well-established colonies, and new identities emerged. As I said, the term Creole referred to Spanish people and other Europeans born in the Americas. So Creole folks have the term has not always been applied to a mixture of light skin or high yellow, if you will, light brown eyes. Creole was a term that was exclusively used for white people. And yet we promenade around and are proud, especially here in Louisiana, are proud of our Creole culture. We wear the term Creole like a badge of honor when in essence it is a label that was for white people first. As the text states that as colonies evolved in the Enlightenment era during this century, 17th, 18th century, these different titles and names evolved. And there are more ideas that relates to that, okay? And that's the gist, and we will close there. Hopefully, this will help you situate yourselves and get prepared for your test. The test is Thursday for my 9:30 and my 2 o'clock class, and Friday for my Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 9, 10, and 11 o'clock class. Please be prepared. Do your best. Strive to be excellent, and let's finish strong. And remember, in closing, always investigate the information you receive. If it is indeed the truth, it should stand the test of investigation. Always ask why, even to me. And I'm never wrong. Peace and understanding.